Salutations, respected viewers. This video is about the retirement of Paul Ryan, Speaker Ryan. He was the leader of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, and as that he's the larger of the two parties, that's why he's got the title Speaker, and he chairs the debate. It's a very prominent position. Well, Speaker Ryan announced just yesterday that he will be stepping aside, not just as Speaker, but as a congressman. So as of January, he will no longer be holding elected office. Well, 48 is rather early to retire. Now, he's married, he's got children, he says he wishes to spend more time with them. That may be so. Wonder why he went into politics in the first place when he had children, or why did he start having children when he was in politics? Either way, doesn't seem entirely logical. Could this be an excuse because he is a rat off a sinking ship? He reckons that the Republicans are going to lose control of the House in the November midterm elections. So it does look bad for the Republicans. Not terrible. They're not that far behind in the opinion polls. They could yet turn it around. Now, in some special elections, the results have been abysmal for the Republicans. They've had drubbings. They're doing much worse than they did in 2016. But, things could happen. Military action always causes an uptick in the president's approval rating, and that will have some effect on his party. Bear in mind, voting for a president and voting for his party are not the same thing. You might be totally anti-Trump but still vote for a Republican to be in Congress for your district, or vice versa. The Democrats often have trouble with turnout. So although the Democrats are significantly ahead in the opinion polls, they may not get such turnout. I acknowledge that in the recent months they've actually done very well on turnout. But reading the tea leaves, it does not augur well for the Republicans. So it could be that. Well, Paul Ryan, he seems like an ideal son of middle America. A certain white bread naivety to him. Is there corn-fed decency to Speaker Ryan? He's not an elitist, not an Ivy League sort of person. Speaks standard American, but he doesn't come across as being too cerebral, because that would be off-putting and indeed seem threatening to many people who are not quite so refined. And he ticks all the boxes of the Republican credo, like as in being pro-guns, being pro-life and so on, being judgmental, I suppose a bit of a neo-Victorian, being a militarist and so on, believing that the war in Iraq was the right thing to do, wrapping himself in old glory. All the rest of it is a policy wonk. He was involved in politics from a very, very early age, working around the fringes of the Republican Party, an anorak as we might call him, but he doesn't come across as being too geeky. Well, his career has been cut short prematurely, and it's a tragic failure of leadership, because this is what speakers are there to do, to stand up for the president, to represent the public when the president fails to do so. People cite Tip O'Neill in the 80s, who was someone who showed he had a spine when it came to President Reagan. Now, admittedly, that's a different situation because they were of opposing parties. But a speaker who's worth his salt would be willing to draw a certain line for a president even of his own party and say, no, that's unacceptable, speak out about what was happening, and not shepherd through legislation that the president wanted if the speaker felt that legislation was unethical, going to be harmful to the country. But what are the virtues of Paul Ryan? Seems to believe what he says. He's affable, he's sincere, there are no skeletons in his cupboard, and he was eminently electable. As you may remember, in 2012, Mitt Romney was the Republican presidential nominee. The Republicans remembered how in 2008 that their vice presidential candidate, Sarah Palin, had lost it for them. So they cast around for a boring white guy, as an anonymous Republican source said, and Paul Ryan was that boring white guy. He was young, but not too young. He seemed to have a golden future ahead of him. For, I suppose, old women, he would be the ideal son-in-law, put it like that. A Blair-like figure without the rictus grin, perhaps. So let's face it, he had the looks. And yes, many people are that shallow. He was tall without being just a giant. And he kept himself trim. He was always very well dressed, very well turned out, very dense hair, no glasses. Couldn't go wrong. He looked the part. there is a less creditable side of him. He kept Guantanamo Bay open. President Obama said, we cannot be holding these people in legal limbo for decades. Some of whom were captured in 2001. They've got to be put on trial. If found guilty, life imprisonment, even execution. If found not guilty, released. We can't have them there. But Congress under Ryan defunded this plan to move the prisoners to the United States, where they would face a proper trial, not just a military tribunal. And Ryan said that would jeopardize national security. It shows just how cowardly he is, just what a huge overreaction there is to these sort of things, because he seems to abrogate the Constitution. Everybody has the right to a fair trial, American citizens or not. And there's not a war on at the moment. I know there's some fighting in the Middle East. It doesn't amount to a war. These people have their human rights too. If they're guilty, right, they could go to Supermax. There's no danger there. And should all people who are supposedly suspected of something just be locked up without trial for decades? What if I suspected Ryan of a crime? Should he be incarcerated without trial for the rest of his life? It's grossly unjust. It's scandalous. And it gives lie to the idea that the United States is a bastion of liberty and can promote it abroad. You see how many people are killed by guns every year in the United States, of the order of 30,000, and yet it would be an outrageous infringement of liberty to restrict firearms, so Ryan thinks. But there's nothing wrong with holding people who, so far as we know, are completely innocent in Guantanamo Bay. And they're in Guantanamo Bay just so they're not technically in the United States. They're in some territory that's leased from Cuba, although Cuba doesn't actually agree to it, hasn't agreed to it for decades. Anyway, he did not speak out against Trump's racist screeds, Trump's constant lying, anything like that. So he really has no backbone, Ryan, and that is his shame. He will go down as a disgracefully feeble speaker. And remember, the supreme virtue in American politics seems to be toughness. But for many Republicans, toughness is never compassion. It's never humanity particularly towards foreigners. Anyway, one of the bitter ironies of Ryan's career is he is a fiscal conservative. He had his genius plan to massively reduce federal spending, there'd be less government activity, and the debt would fall precipitously. However, he has presided over precisely the opposite. This new Republican budget is going to blow a massive hole in the US budget, just going far more into debt, billions upon billions of dollars. Bear in mind, he excoriated Obama for increasing the national debt in 2008, when Obama had to save the country from imploding economically. So it's all about tax cuts for billionaires, slashing Medicare, slashing Medicaid, making the average American so much worse off in that sense, because they're not having, poor people are not having such access to healthcare. It's really sickening. It's like the height of immorality to deny healthcare to penurious children just so billionaires can have even more money. And Paul Ryan, he's a man who doesn't mind bashing the Bible. What about mercy? What about caring for the needy, as Jesus would want you to do? Anyway, the evidence of growth from slashing taxes for the super wealthy is very mixed. There's this differential propensity to spend, and the poorest people spend every penny they have because they need to. And I've heard people say that's more of a motor of the economy than cutting taxes for people who are already extraordinarily affluent. And if this is this magic formula for prosperity, why isn't every country doing it? I don't know of any country that's done it successfully. Anyway, I've never studied economics. Perhaps it shows. There should be the biggest economic growth ever if what Ryan has said is true, but it's not growing bigly at the moment. In fact, it's a little bit stagnant. So Ryan, he was so promising in the beginning, and I think he's been a terrible disappointment to people. He could yet have been a president. I know he'd lost the vice presidency, but he could have had a long career ahead of him. So he's bowing out, I suppose, because he thinks that his party is going to go down in flames, and he may well have lost his Wisconsin seat. Well, I don't miss him terribly. I have a fear that someone worse will come along. Because he had quite a following, this is a bad sign for the Republicans. He was a highly effective fundraiser by all accounts. And incumbents tend to be re-elected. So it's quite bad news. He's a bit of a bellwether for the party. If he thinks it's time to retire at 48, then the party really is in for a hammering, and I think they richly deserve it.